We welcome you, Dr. Susan Bean. She is an independent curator and consultant focusing on the visual culture of modern South Asia from the colonial period to the present. Her title is The Rise of People's Art, the Craft of Raw Clay Sculpture in 21st Century Bengal.
First of all, I want to say big thanks to Debbie Tyagarajan and to Stephen Inglis for having the wacky and wonderful idea to have a new incarnation of this seminar that we had 20 years ago, and to do it again. And as I was listening to the first couple of talks, I was thinking about how one of the wonderful things about getting older is that you don't just read about history in books, you experience it. So that's what we are able to speak from now is some experiencing of real changes. And I want to talk about an aspect of that in my own research in Bengal on the making of raw or unfired clay sculptures for festivals, Hindu festivals of Durga and Kali and Saraswati and so on. 20 years ago, at the first incarnation of this symposium, I presented the work of clay sculptors in Bengal who specialize in unfired or raw clay sculpture, images of deities, portraits, and statuaries. Can I have the first slide? Okay, so 20 years ago, I was talking about this kind of work that you're seeing on the screen. At left is an ancestor portrait in clay. At the center is an image of Lakshmi under construction. And on the right is a statue that was going to be part of a diorama about some colonial uprising in the Calcutta area. And 20 years ago, I said that their practice constitutes a counterexample to the established narrative of craft in India's cultural history. According to that established narrative, and it was made during the colonial era in the late 19th century, Indian industrial art or craft was much to be admired, whereas art or fine art was scarcely to be found in India. Colonial administrators instituted schools and training programs to improve Indian industrial arts. Gradually, a distinct arena for art, that is fine art, took form among an elite group of educated gentleman painters using formats, materials, and styles akin to Western painting. And I'm thinking about the Tagore family painters, Ravi Varma, the Bengal school, and so on. After the turn of the century, the Indian nationalist movement adopted the cause of craft for its ability to employ millions of laborers while at the same time enhancing Swadeshi aims. From 1947, the government of India incorporated craft into national development schemes, principally for its income-generating potential. Government agencies were set up to offer training, access to materials, and marketing assistance. The government also created a system of awards to encourage quality and recognize excellence. When I spoke about raw or unfired clay modeling 20 years ago, I wanted to draw attention to assumptions implicit in this institutionalized narrative of craft. Though emphases shifted somewhat from the colonial regime to the National Museum and into the national movement and into the programs of the Indian government, all of these perspectives conceived craft as traditional, handmade production using simple tools passed in families between generations, largely unchanged, working in practices that were overwhelmingly in decline, like the one that Stephen was talking about. Much as colonial administrators had done, the Indian government categorized artisans as laborers according to their specialties, weaving, pottery, painting, metalsmithing, and so on. Their aim was to help such craftspeople make more saleable work. Next slide, please. But the work of the Murchilpis, the clay modelers in Bengal, was not in decline in the 20th century. It was growing with the spread of annual festivals for deities, especially goddesses. Nor was clay sculpture a very old traditional practice in Bengal, having emerged to prominence in the mid-18th century. So, for example, on the screen, the image at left is of a new goddess who was dreamt in the middle of the 18th century, Jagadhatri. Moreover, some clay modelers in the early 19th century were playing leading roles in the cosmopolitanization of modern art practices. In particular, they were developing European-inspired naturalistic realism, such as in the portrait of a Muslim at prayer on the right. And both of these pieces, as you can see on the screen, were done in the early 1800s. Because clay modelers were sculptors who worked in commonplace, fragile, raw clay, often in a hybrid style, that is a westernized style, and principally produced images of deities, their work was not readily categorized either as industrial art or as fine art. Through the 20th century, clay modeling remained peripheral to the worlds of art and craft in India. 20 years ago, I presented Bengal's clay modeling to advocate for a broader, more variegated appreciation of the aesthetic, sociological, and economic complexities of making things in South Asia. In the intervening decades, though the art-craft dichotomy persists, much has happened to make it seem even more and more, to me, like a zombie apparition, this difference. Next slide, please. By the late 20th century, Durga puja and other festivals centered on unfired clay images had unequivocally moved from their earlier venues in the mansions of elite families. And in the painting at left, you see a Durga image, clay image, that was erected in a mansion where the family invited neighbors and guests and so on to participate. And some families still make this kind of image for their home, but there are many other things, as you know and will see in my slides, that they do instead. Instead of homes, the predominant setting for these celebrations became the community in public places. For most pujas, simple constructions of bamboo covered in cloth were erected to shelter the clay image. For Durga Puja especially, local puja associations in Kolkata and other urban areas commissioned grand temporary shelters where the goddess could be visited inside temples, and you can do the next slide, temples, national capitals, Hollywood, Bollywood film sets. And these are Durga pandals in Kolkata from the 1990s. Most of these elaborate puja installations were the work of three art practices: the clay modelers who made the images of Durga and her children, the pandal decorators who devised temporary structures of bamboo, and after the 1950s also plywood helped them a lot, that came into use, and cloth to house the images, and the lighting workshops that magically illuminated the pandals in the evenings. And I just wanted to point out, most of these are pretty obviously either copies of particular temples, imaginary temples, or in the case of the ship, this was the year of the American movie, The Titanic, and so there was a Durga in the Titanic. In the new millennium, so now I'm switching to the last 20 years, since our first symposium, several developments have converged stimulating more ambitious puja pandals that integrate the production of pratimas, images, temporary architecture, the pandals, and lighting to create what are called theme pujas. That's the term that's locally used for it. These changes catapulted the festival to new heights. Perhaps the most important development unleashing these changes, almost ironically, were the impacts of the 1990s economic liberalization in India, expanding the arena for private industry, commerce, and international trade. These changes brought new sources of financial support and new materials and technologies to be tapped for puja installations. The next slide, please. So this is what the lane leading to a puja pandal looks like nowadays. It's just filled chock-a-block with commercial advertising. And in the very background of that, you can see a 19th century colonial mansion that's made of thermocol. Corporate sponsorship, in the inset is a close-up of the puja pandal that is made to look like a colonial mansion. Corporate sponsorship and advertising have become the financial engine of 21st century Durga Puja. Advertising space is given in exchange for financing the city's most elaborate puja displays, because they're very expensive to put up. And these displays, in turn, attract hundreds of thousands of visitors during the nights of the celebration. New materials and new technologies became more accessible with the relaxing of red tape and restrictions that used to hamper imports and industrial entrepreneurship. The impacts on 21st century developments in Durga Puja have been dramatic. So you can see that thermocol mansion. Can you do the next slide, please? Yeah. And at left is a man in a workshop carving a thermocol image that will be used for decoration. It's not a pratima. For their fanciful architectural constructions, decorators moved beyond bamboo, plywood, and cotton cloth. At the turn of the new century, both fiberglass, which is plastic reinforced with glass fiber, and thermocol, which is also a plastic, a polystyrene plastic, enabled the production of new pandal elements. The next slide, please. The decorative illumination of pandals was also transformed when lighting workshops were able to acquire LED equipment. Lighting specialists of Chandanagar, which is just a town just north of Calcutta and was a source of the lighting specialists for this festival, they turned to LED lights in the 1990s because equipment imported from Germany, Korea, and Japan, and later on China, became available to them. The new LED lights reduced the impact of the soaring cost of electricity, which had been hampering the possibilities of their displays. And the new LED equipment offered much more design flexibility. Next slide, please. And opened new avenues for innovative illumination. The fame of Chandanagar lighting workshops has spread far beyond Bengal, across the country and beyond. In contrast to lighting and pandal architecture, major transformations in clay images have been more stylistic than technical, though not entirely. Some puja associations have installed main images of materials other than raw clay. And you can put on the next slide. These are examples of non-raw clay puja pandals. At left is a lower budget neighborhood pandal where I thought it was wonderful, a art school graduate came in and painted a huge mural of a town in its Durga installation. But you can, and that's a painting, so you can't worship it and you can't immerse it. But you can see at the lower left of the left-hand slide, there's a small clay image. And that's where the rituals were performed, and that was what would be immersed at the end of the festival. And at right, one of the star puja designers and sculptors, Babatosh Sutar, who has been trying to make a bridge between making pratima, images for worship, and making art. He made a terracotta puja. So that would have, image. And so that would have also had a subsidiary one for the rituals that would have been immersed. And then he was able to have this acquired by a 5-star hotel in Kolkata, which some of you may have seen since then. But this kind of crossover has been not very successful, not worked very well. The next slides, please. However, the vast preponderance of pratima are still modeled in clay over a straw core, so that the image can be worshipped and immersed to disintegrate in a river or tank. 4 examples are on the screen. At upper left, the 2018 Ahirtola Jubak Brinda Durga image in North Calcutta was offered as an homage to sex workers and their community. At upper right, the Shiv Mandir Pandal, the 2012 theme, pondered the ethics of cloning, and they imagined the problems, ethical problems of cloning through a story, a mythological story, where numbers of ashuras are created by the drops of blood that fall. And so you can see that that's underneath her there. Instead of one ashura, there are many. At lower left, there is one of the very few women clay modelers in Kolkata, China Pal, who is standing next to her 2015 Ardhanarishwara Durga, honoring transgender people. At lower right, the much discussed and debated 2012 pratima of another star sculptor designer, Shanatan Dinda, in which the ashura underneath with the wings is a self-portrait of the artist. And that year there was tremendous controversy about whether this was something he should do or not do. And so these works, in a sense, for the sake of stimulating local dialogue on a number of issues, are very much akin to conceptual art in a global arena, but this is very much a local event. The overall conceptual coordination in the new theme pujas of clay image, pandal construction, and lighting is largely the product of another major development in Kolkata's Durga Puja, the new role of puja designer. Some who have taken on this role are image makers or pandal builders, but most are art college graduates with exposure to broad ranges of materials, techniques, and styles who have opted for careers in design. A few of them have succeeded in winning enough commissions to work throughout the year for the following season's Durga Puja. Others supplement their earnings as puja designers, creating sets for television, film, weddings, and other special events. A few use their incomes from designing pandals to support their aspirations as artists, as painters or sculptors who show their work in galleries. Next slide, please. The stunning achievements of these collaborations between puja organizers, designers, pandal builders, image makers, and lighting specialists are celebrated in an elaborate system of awards. And this is at one of the pandals, all the awards that they have won in recent years. This is what you see when you enter the enclosure. Begun by Asian Paints in the 1980s, there are now a couple of dozen organizations recognizing artistic, conceptual, and social excellence. These awards, conferred at the start of the puja, elevate the public profiles of the winners with media attention, drawing many more thousands of pandal hoppers. In turn, this popularity attracts more corporate sponsorship and advertising to the puja organization, enabling them the following year to engage the most inventive, creative team for their Durga pandal. At the same time, the prize-winning designers, technicians, craftspeople, artists, studios, workshops that collaborated on the pandal receive acclaim that translates into higher fees for their work. And then, yes, the last slide is on the screen. This is my last slide. These are two scenes of an evening where there's a crush of pandal hoppers at popular pujas in the city, enjoying what is at once a heady interplay between religious observance, public art show, and popular festival. It's all of those things at once. The developments I have described in the Durga pujas of the last 20 years have blurred, if not obliterated, conventional boundaries between art, craft, and commercial design. Is a sculptor who works in raw clay an artist or an artisan? Is a specialist who works with LED lights an engineer, a technician, a craftsman, or an artist? Can thermocol carving be considered a craft in India? How do these terms and the distinctions they project shed light on our aims to comprehend the terrain of visual culture production in contemporary India? I submit that the distinctions between art, craft, and design remain relevant chiefly in one respect. They serve to acknowledge and maintain a hierarchy established in the colonial period, placing fine art at the pinnacle and industrial art or craft at the base. Art, craft, and design are relevant socioeconomic categories. Artists work in globally acknowledged genres and connect with wealthy clients. Artists who make it in the gallery circuit gain high prices and prestige. The most successful among them become part of the elite. Designers are formally educated, able to compete for good jobs as commercial artists in film or advertising, and maintain standing in the middle class. Craftsmen cater to a much broader middling clientele. Craft practices are situated in workshops where requisite skills are acquired from elders, even for those who also attend art college. They learn a lot of what they do from the older generation in their practice. Most practitioners are from low-caste backgrounds lacking in English language skills. They remain poorly compensated for their work and concentrated in crowded neighborhoods with few amenities. In Calcutta, for example, the clay modelers in Kumartuli live in virtual slum conditions, despite the widespread admiration of their artistry. This hierarchy of visual culture production remains a social fact, inscribed in class distinctions separating art school-trained fine artists from commercial designers and makers rooted in the labors of workshop environments. My takeaway from revisiting Bengali clay modelers 20 years after our first symposium is that our work as rapporteurs on art practices is most productive when we put aside old received categories and focus instead on how makers are actually situated with clear-eyed attention to issues of caste, class, language, and education, to understand the challenges they face, their creative and technical aspirations, and their evolving relationships with clientele and markets. Thanks.
Do you understand what the attraction is for the modern Calcutta Pandal hopper in seeing the reconstruction in a kind of a Hollywood style or a Bollywood style of an old bara bari? What is going on there that they would want to see the false front of that old house?
I just think that in that particular instance, it's a kind of romanticization. It makes the old-fashioned family puja, because there's a Durga inside there, as there would have been in an elite colonial house. It makes it for them to see. We all love to romanticize the past. And it gives, and this is what I think of, this was a part of this paper that ended up on the cutting room floor, because I would have had you here all day, that I couldn't talk about, is that I think a feature of all of these pandals, and what makes this such an exciting event in Kolkata, and if you've never been, you must put it on your bucket list. Things to do, is that for this period of less than a week, the whole world, all of history, Hollywood films, Bollywood films, old-time Calcutta, the Washington National Capitol, the Hermitage, whatever. It's translated by local people into a local idiom, and it's made for the people who are out in the evenings walking all around. It's as if they own the world, they own history, they own cosmology. It's theirs to play with and enjoy for 6 or 7 days.
So it's merely entertainment that is now become a big carnival, but the religious aspect of the puja is kind of lost?
No, it's not lost.
Do they go there to worship? Do they make donations?
Yes. You can see in the midst of all of these people who are there with their smartphone cameras taking pictures and enjoying the festival aspect, there are also people doing puja who will look all around. They'll take out their smartphone and take pictures, and then they'll go up to the image and they'll venerate. So that happens, and if you go on certain days, you will see the priests there. And there are arguments sometimes. There are pandals where priests haven't liked the images and thought they were improper and refused to worship them. But by and large, that's worked out. And so it coexists. They are at the same time an art event, because this is not just people out having fun. They're also talking about which is the most beautiful Durga, which is the most well conceptualized and executed theme. So that's art talk. They're worshiping, they're enjoying art, and they're taking pictures with their cell phones and buying snacks on the street. So what could be better? I mean, I was the museum curator for many decades, and we always wanted people to come in and to enjoy the art and be together and all of that. So for me, it's a spectacular kind of, not a spectacle, but a spectacular kind of event.
Thanks so much, Susan. With this new type of sponsorship by Intel and
Yeah.
others. What's happened with the neighborhoods who were responsible for the pandals? You know,
Okay.
how there were clubs who would go
Yeah.
and collect monies. Are we seeing now a kind of a hierarchy in terms of
Yeah.
these neighborhoods and this other?
There are some puja organizations that have decided to go for the big time pandal, to raise as much money as they can, to hire the best artisans to do the work. And so they're in this cycle with the commercial support. And there are still neighborhoods that don't do that. And they, like the one that I showed with the big mural, where that was a much more modest, much more inexpensive installation where they hired one of their neighborhood artists to do the painting. So there's a whole range, and there's still families that install very old-fashioned looking Durgas in their homes to worship.
The Durga worship move out of the house into the public space? I mean, can you pinpoint any 1 or 2 years or not? Or what?
It seemed to start in the early 19th century. I mean, the story of it is that not just Durga Puja, but all these other goddess festivals in Bengal that use clay images were popularized by certain local jamindars in the middle of the 18th century. And they would encourage, they would invite people into their palaces to see the Durgas, but they would also encourage neighborhood pujas. And there would be neighborhood associations, relatives who would get together and hire a professional image maker and hire somebody to make a lovely bamboo structure with pleated cloth on it. And so it grew that way, but there have been, you know, one would have to study, like I seem to see in the 1990s with liberalization. It unleashed a whole range of new possibilities that some people really took advantage of. So it has changed at faster and slower paces over time.
Yeah, you spoke of hierarchies of
Yeah.
art, craft and design, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think? What do you think of the example I showed today? Is that an example?
Yeah.
Do you see it as well? Okay.
Yeah.
Asking you. Yeah.
I was listening to that aspect of it, and what I was interested in is the way the artist you were presenting to us felt a real connection to craft producers in his town, and felt that they had something that was meaningful and aesthetic at the same time to offer, just as he did something meaningful and something aesthetic, and that he had a sensibility of his relationship as a painter to the craft producers that was much more sort of integrated than the kind of the picture I'm painting of the establishment view of art, design, and craft in India.
In fact, I was trying to show that by being involved with the community, being involved with crafts, being involved in revitalizing traditions by trying to save it or intervening, he was actually transcending or in fact subverting some of these hierarchies, no? I think.
Well, that's true. He was, and my part of my problem with the way craft is dealt with in India in the 20th and 21st centuries is that one has to be really careful about not making those hierarchies more rigid rather than less rigid. And I think a lot of the government programs, because they're sort of established and routine now, go towards the more hierarchical version. And a lot of the more interesting work has been done by NGOs that have found in their own ways that this kind of hierarchy needs to be undermined in order to move into the future.
Yeah, in Stephen's photographs, we saw these hundreds of horses. They fade away with time, sink into the earth. Whereas here, were you, at any point of time, did you witness the immersion this? And what's the feeling of the artisans when they are finally immersed after a few days of the puja? It's just a comparison.
Well, that's another thing. I'm in the midst of a big project on unfired clay sculpture in South Asia. And one of the things that is valued about it at different times and places across the subcontinent is that it melts into earth. And the idea that art is supposed to last forever is a kind of modern idea, that it's supposed to last and it's supposed to increase in value so your children can inherit it and sell it and be rich. But that's not how it's always seen. So in this instance, you make a beautiful image of the goddess, and that's there for people to enjoy as a beautiful object, and it enhances their devotion and their worship. And then when it's finished, and it goes into the river and melts into mud.
If I could just add to that, one thing I didn't mention was before potters, with the traditional right to make these kinds of horses, begin their work, they go to one of the temples where they've already left horses, and they take one handful of clay or sand from those places where the horses are deteriorating. That goes into the new clay. That is about the most materialist and obvious sign that they feel that there's no real separation between one generation of horses and another.
Yeah.
It's really
It's the same lineage.
it's a recycling of materials in a sacred way. So the distinction between this horse and last year's horse and 10 years' horse is not a real distinction at all. It's just a circuit that's revolving.
Not really a question, but two things. One is that I think, having worked with craftspeople over more than 20 years now, 40 years, is that craftspeople are they're creative, but they're also quite pragmatic. And so they don't get very attached to something they make, and they quite like the idea that it is subsumed, which gives them an opportunity to redo it next year, and it gives them for them to move forward. The other thing that I really love about the pujas in Calcutta, or in Delhi or wherever, in Bengali communities, is that in a country which is so full of class and caste, it brings together people, not the makers, where there is this hierarchy you talked of, but in the people who are going to see it. There is a classness, there's a companionship, a camaraderie, which is quite wonderful to experience.
When you said it's a good time to visit Calcutta, when is it?
It's in October usually. You know, it varies. Yeah. You can easily find out online by putting in the year you're thinking about going, and it'll tell you what the dates are. Yes, you can look at the moon.
I just wanted to add one more point. Since I hail from Sri Ramakrishna Mission, people who hail from Calcutta, yet another science that goes behind this clay is raw clay, unfired clay is, see, the Ganapati festival and Durga puja, Navratri puja, they fall in the months where the monsoon starts. So it's a practice, that's the science that goes behind it. They dig the clay from the water bodies just to deepen it, to encourage more storage of water. The goddess is invoked, the god is invoked, they prayed for a few days, and again it gets submerged into the same river, the same water body, so that there is no erosion also. So that was yet another intelligence that was handled by our artisans, where science and life and the preservation of the environment, everything went hand in hand. There was no like separation. And that was one other important reason that went behind immersion of unfired clay pratimas into the water bodies. So I just wanted to add this point. Thank you.
I think we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much, Susan Bean. Very interesting.